and then I'm going to follow up.
So, thank you for coming. Hello, everybody. What I am going to do is, as you had Nick Morgan, who is quite the most extraordinary person in whisky, I was thinking that he has told you all about Johnny Walker and in the historical context of what Johnny Walker means to whisky and what happened with all the blends and everything that he did. And so what I am going to do is I am going to read to you from my book, which was, if you've not heard of it, it's called Chasing the Dram. It's a travelogue about whisky. It's a whisky travelogue. I wanted to go round Scotland and basically visit distilleries with friends and family, have a good time and write about it. And Simon & Schuster were silly enough to give me money to do that, so I did. And it all sounded incredibly glamorous. So I lived in London at the time, and I thought one of the things I really needed to do was you really can't understand whisky without understanding Johnny Walker. So what I did was I went to Kilmarnock to go to Johnny Walker's grave. And I have to say, if you have ever got the chance to go to Kilmarnock to visit Johnny Walker's grave, don't go. I've been for you. I went on a wet Sunday in January, and it was not fantastic. Now, I'm trying to find exactly how I will talk about it. Okay, so basically what I wanted to do in the chapter is called Super Blends, and it was about how blends are the whiskies that really got the industry going, and the 19th century blends and all the new ones made since are what make it such a big seller. And if, like me, you are searching for the spirit of whisky, which was the tagline of the book, tribute has to be paid to the great blenders of yore. This is why, on a wet Sunday at the beginning of January, I ended up on an empty train at 10 o'clock in the morning on the way to Kilmarnock to meet Willie from Saltcoats. Willie told his pals that he wasn't going round to theirs to play the guitar because he was going to Kilmarnock to see the grave of someone he neither knew nor was related to, and to a shop that wasn't there, as a pal of his was writing a book about it. They says to him, "You've got a pal writing a book about graves, Willie?" "No, it's about whisky." "And you're going to a graveyard in Kilmarnock for that?" "Aye." "Fair enough. See you later." Willie is one of the first people living in Scotland who I followed on Twitter when it was new and shiny and everyone was nice to each other. I don't know if anybody can remember those prehistoric social media days. A gasfitter in his early 30s, he had originally been in the fishing industry, as his father had owned a small trawler. The fishing industry on the west coast went into further decline, and all that remained were some langoustine boats, so he went to work on a large trawler for a few years. He was eventually replaced on that boat by cheaper Filipino workers, and ended up back in Saltcoats looking for a job that year. He's one of those people who could get a piece at any door. Now, a piece at any door is a really Scottish phrase. It's a West of Scotland phrase, and it means that you can get a sandwich at any door that you knock on because everybody really likes you. I had battles with my editor to get that phrase, for them to allow me to keep that phrase in, and I will say it again. He is one of those people who could get a piece at any door. You'd welcome Willie into your house and start off giving him the sandwich, tea, plate of food or whisky that your culture of hospitality demanded, and end up wanting to give him more just for the pleasure of his easy company. Now, it seemed that most of Britain was flooded that January. I think this was January 2016. Whitby in North Yorkshire had almost been cut off. Cumbria seemed to be almost completely underwater, as were large parts of the borders. The rivers Dee and Tay had burst their banks and flooded towns and villages along their route. Abergildy Castle, a 450-year-old building near Balmoral beside the River Dee, was visibly shaking in its foundations due to the floodwaters. Given climate change, this may be, well, what happens every year from now on. And thank goodness those days are behind us, because it's got so much better in the next 5 years. My train journey southwest from Glasgow was just dreich. The sky was so dark and dull, a blue, that the streetlights of every town were still on. Every hill and field looked like a sodden, misshapen woolen jumper that had just been left to drip in the hope that one day it might be dry enough to wear. The trees were all bare of leaves and scraggy, leaning in directions that the wind had battered them into, and the cows were all huddled in corners of fields, dripping. Christmas was over and New Year finished. I was on a rickety two-carriage train with one other passenger who looked like he was coming back from a night out and was trying to sleep with his jacket pulled up to his chin and his hood up. I was on my way to spend the day in a town that even the ScotRail website said the only good thing was happening there was a jumping off place to go somewhere else, with only February to go look forward to. And it just would not stop raining. If all of this wasn't sufficiently ominous, I wasn't far enough on in my research to know that no journey should be undertaken without supplies. Had I realised this, I would have made Whisky Tiffin and taken it with me. Now, Whisky Tiffin is then one of the recipes in my book, and I have to say it is one of the nicest ones. And if you like chocolate, and who doesn't, and if you like biscuits, it's a really good recipe to make. There is a popular myth that the whole of the British Isles runs on beer in pubs, but that is a mere fantasy of the past, where everyone drank warm ale from brown jugs, served by portly whiskered men in braces. Today's Britain is fuelled almost entirely by tea, coffee, and the tray bake. It is not scones or Victoria sponge that keep us going, fond as we are of thinking so. It's those pieces of flapjack, brownie, millionaire shortbread or tiffin that are baked or cooled in a rectangular tray, cut into squares and then eaten. Walk into any bakery, supermarket or cafe anywhere in the UK and you will see the square slice of cake is the best-selling item. Without the tray bake, we would descend into utter chaos. Yes, it can get even worse. Just imagine all the angry, sugar-deprived women stomping around looking for someone to take their frustration out on. And then I have my recipe for Whisky Tiffin. So when the train arrives at Kilmarnock, it has miraculously stopped raining, and I stand outside the station opposite some closed pubs with peeling paint doors and blacked out windows waiting for Willie at the appointed time. He's not there, and this is not a station in the centre of the city, so there's no one inside to sit in, no coffee to be had, and it all looks pretty empty. Willie is on a bus, on a Sunday service that seems to be going from Saltcoats to Kilmarnock via every single tiny village in Ayrshire, so he'll be a while. I best go to the bus stop and meet him. Like most of post-industrial Scotland, modern times have been very cruel to Kilmarnock. It went from being a tiny village to a large town thanks to the Industrial Revolution, and at one point had several coal mines plus carpet and shoe factories. Some of the first trains were built in Kilmarnock, and there was all manner of other heavy engineering production in the town. Almost all of that has now gone, or has been run with a fraction of the staff, and it's been replaced by really nothing much. I do not live in the great world of nostalgia for Scotland's industrial past. Someone I spoke to for this book told me that working in heavy industry gave men a sense of meaning, and while conditions were not great and wages were not enough for a decent standard of living, they still felt they had a role in life. There is an argument that closing the industry and taking the sense of purpose from men and women in towns and cities across Scotland generated a lot of the ill health from which post-industrial Scotland still suffers, especially among working class men. I know the stories of towns in their decline. I know of GPs who went to work in mining villages in the late 1970s expecting to become specialists in bronchial disorders, but becoming HIV and AIDS experts instead, as the towns lost their mines and therefore the reason for being, only to have them replaced by heroin and an outflow of people. I know of former industrial towns much smaller than Kilmarnock, where almost no one has had a job in 3 generations, and children know that to do anything, even the most basic of jobs, they'll have to leave. We Scots do love a heavy dose of sentimental nostalgia, so much so that even that's not what it used to be. I'll read that again because that was quite a good line. I forgot about that line. We Scots do love a heavy dose of sentimental nostalgia, so much so that even that isn't what it used to be. But anyone spending any time reading Scottish writing of the 1930s knows that heavy industry, the working conditions, the low pay and dreadful housing conditions were seen as scourges foisted upon a class of people who had become dispensable in the countryside due to modern farming methods. and land taken up with sheep and shooting estates, while the upper classes got even wealthier off the back of industry, trade and empire. So, one of the things you can say, but the loss of that heavy industry, particularly as working and housing conditions improved in the latter half of the 20th century, can only be unlamented if it is replaced by something better than heroin, and that never happened in the 80s. What that kind of hardship does breed in people is humour and resilience, and Keely's people from Kilmarnock have that in bucket loads. Nothing is more emblematic of this than their football team anthem. In the 70s and early 80s, open hostility and violence between rival fans reached a vicious peak. Aside from the sectarian hellhole that was a Rangers and Celtic game, rival Protestant and Catholic Glasgow teams playing each other against the background of civil war in Northern Ireland, the atmosphere of almost any other league football game was ugly and threatening. The story goes, and to be honest, who cares if it's 100% true or not, was that a fan in a supporters bus en route to an away game was so sickened by all the hatred that after hearing the Marie Osmond song Paper Roses on the radio, decided that should be Kilmarnock FC's new anthem. Somehow it caught on. You have to imagine it. The opposing team's fans are shouting and chanting and screaming at you, calling you and your players every name in the sun. Their aim is to provoke you to equal chanting, shouting, screaming, and maybe a punch-up afterwards. Your answer? Every single fan on your team waving their scarf, singing a song about your love being fake, like Paper Roses. It was quite a sight. Even now that Scottish football is not what it was in terms of violence and hatred, watching a load of football fans waving scarves and singing cheesy 1970s love songs still bring a smile to even the sternest of faces. It doesn't end there. In 2013, Marie Osmond was in Scotland and played the club a special visit. Aside from having to smile a very expensive smile and say everything is wonderful as part of her profession, she really seems to be having fun on the STV News Report archive. The fans watching her look overawed that the singer of their beloved anthem is actually there and going to sing for them. And one of them shows the TV cameras the Asda work contract that Marie had autographed for him. The fan who met her in Las Vegas and organised her visit has a cheaper but just as big a smile as Marie. This beats the odd win, he told the News. It doesn't beat the 2012 or the 1997 win, but it certainly relegates my marriage to the 5th best day of my life, I can assure you. What the 4th best day of his life was remains a mystery to the Scottish TV viewing public. To get to the bus station to go and meet Willie, I go down King Street, the main street of the centre of Kilmarnock. Its buildings, like most towns of its size in Scotland, are a hotspot of everything from foreboding solid 18th century Presbyterian severity to yellow brick badly made with paper walls in the early 90s and post-World War II brutalist disasters. There's every chain common in places with more shopping ambition than actual cash, and none of them are open. The street itself was a victim of the great plague of monoblocking that afflicted town planners of the 1990s. A mixture of misplaced infectious enthusiasm, an unused brick mountain, and a desire to be seen to be doing something on the part of town councils meant that hundreds, possibly thousands of serviceable streets that were perfectly fine and at most needed re-tarmacked were levelled off and covered in the paving that had previously only graced the driveways and back gardens of those who treated both wildlife and taste with bleak contempt. In Kilmarnock, they had the added touch of a couple of street sculptures by Shonach and Loch, but the half-torso of a swimmer coming up through the monoblock has more the look of, what in the name of the wee man am I doing here, than being full of the joy of Kilmarnock. Now, I am going to move on to when I meet Willie. Willie arrives in a pup of big blue waterproofs, and we get going to find the famous blue plaque of Kilmarnock. It's not an official round blue plaque. It's a wee rectangle put there by the council on a building that is a pawn shop next to Claire's Accessories. It reads, Site of Johnny Walker's shop. This is the site of the original John Walker grocer shop where in 1820 John Walker was set up by his trustees as a miner. John Walker, founder of John Walker and Son, producers of the world-renowned Johnny Walker Scotch whisky, was the son of an Ayrshire farmer, Alexander Walker of Tudrigs. The most popular Scotch whisky brand in the world, a bottle of Johnny Walker is being sold every 2 seconds, which amounts to more than 17 million cases annually, twice as many as Ballantine's, the next leading brand. The empire started at the comparatively humble grocer shop, now a pawn shop, owned by John Walker on King Street, Kilmarnock. The premises were bought with the proceeds of the sale of his family's farm on the death of his father in 1819, when John was just 14 years old. Standing there, Willie looks really unimpressed. It starts raining again. I've never noticed this plaque before, Rachel, he says. Well, now you have. Aye, he shrugs, getting wetter. Now, then I have some stuff about the whisky and coffee and grain whiskies. And then we decide that we need to go to see Johnny Walker's grave. Because obviously, like we've seen the shop, it's wet, it's not impressive, so we need to go and see the grave. So we have to cross the main street, and the only other pedestrian we see walks straight past us. She has those long legs and perfectly bouncy hair that can only be achieved without great effort by a 19-year-old. And she has put no effort in at all. She has a khaki-coloured coat with a hood that she isn't wearing up even in the rain, and has the heavy makeup that young women desperately trying to look more grown up than they feel wear during the day. As she walks past, we both realise she is also holding the biggest coned reefer either of us has ever seen out in public. We both try not to stare. Neither of us manages. I've no seen that even in Brixton, says Willie. Well, there's not much Met-style stop and search of wee lassies in Kilmarnock, I imagine, I say. No, agrees Willie, and not a lot else to do on a Sunday afternoon. Willie raises his eyebrows and looks at me hopefully. I shake my head sadly, although given the nature of the day, a wee fly smoke by Johnny Walker's grave might have been the thing to do. We cross the road and trudge up a hill and get to the St Andrew's Glencairn Church of Scotland Church, a place where all are welcome and there's a mother and toddler group twice a week. Where all are most definitely not welcome is the churchyard beside the church, as the gate is padlocked. My heart sinks. I have come all this way, dragged Willie out in a Sunday service bus to visit the grave of someone neither of us knew nor were related to, and didn't think to find out if the churchyard was open. When I told people, acquaintances and work colleagues, that I was working on a book, going round bits of Scotland, looking at whisky and food matching and cooking with it, the reaction went from envious side-eye and, oh, that sounds like an interesting project, to a big booming laugh and a shout of, you jammy bugger, why the hell didn't I think to pitch that? I actually think I hate you. It was supposed to be an adventure that was a cross between Brigadoon and Whisky Galore. I was supposed to be constantly covered in tartan or tweed, being wooed by whisky companies in fancy hotels and trying whisky that sank with the Titanic, or stuff that is so expensive that only me, 4 whisky writers and some billionaire oligarchs have tried. I should be in a blending room or a fancy tasting room in a distillery, one of those with soft lighting and bars lined with oak, drinking pre-Indian Mutiny Macallan. I should have brand ambassadors and distillery managers being nice to me, handing me drams and telling me stories over a log fire. This is what everyone else thinks I'm doing while researching this book. Nobody, not one single person, imagines me standing ankle deep in muddy grass in front of a padlock gate outside a churchyard in a post-industrial central Scottish town on a wet Sunday in January. I am clearly doing this very wrong. I look up and I see Willie on the other side of the gates, Come round, Rachel. It's open the other side. Thank God for that. We get to the graveyard. It's bigger than I imagined. There's a lot of unreadable gravestones as the elements and plants have worn them away. John Walker died in 1857. That's 159 years of stone exposure to rain, wind and lichen. We are never going to find this grave. We decide to split up. Willie taking the right-hand side, me the left. I can hardly decipher a thing. He's not having much more luck. After about 5 minutes, he shouts at me, "Here, it's here! It's got a new stone and everything!" I trudge through muddy grass while Willie stands beside it, pointing. The Argentinian comedian Enrique Pinte used to do a routine about tourists going from Argentina to Europe for the one and only time that they would have been able to afford it. One of the things that they would have to go and see would be the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. All of their friends would be telling them how amazing it was and how moved they would feel upon gazing at the painting. And you're just standing in front of it thinking, it's fine. I mean, it's okay. It's a nice painting. But I'm not overwhelmed. But my God, I should cry, if only for the life savings I've spent coming here. I really need to feel something. The Germans must have an expression for that utter lack of feeling when you finally reach the end of your pilgrimage. Willie stared at me. "Well, it's the grave." "Aye," I said, "so it is." "Will we go to the pub?" Willie wanted to go to the Weatherspoons. Cheap beer, Rachel. And there's almost always a fight you can watch in that Weatherspoons. It's where everybody goes. And that was it. That was my amazing trip to Kilmarnock.
That was fabulous.
And you can read more about it and you never have to go.
Thank you, Rachel. Your service to humankind and whiskey kind is going to be gratefully received. Thank you. Question. In the meantime, the latecomers, Rachel McCormack has been reading from Chasing the Dram, and she's just switched their camera off.
Have I?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, well.
No.
No? Okay, well, you might find it comes back in a minute. It may be that the bandwidth is problematic. We can hear you, though. Say something?
Well, that's fine. Yeah, I can see you now, and I can see. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. If you manage to find.
No, there's
James
nothing.
Is saying the camera is fine.
I think it's maybe you.
Sorry, it's just me then. Sorry. Thanks, James.
Yeah.
It's just Nick Morgan's just asked, Rachel, didn't you even get a killie pie?
No, I did not get a killie pie, Nick. The only shop that was open was Marks and Spencer's.
I'm imagining Nick Morgan is one of the only other two people that's ever visited that grave as well. So,
and I'm sure Nick had the sense not to go in January.
Okay. Okay. So just coming back, I'll stepping away from whiskey a bit, but you built your reputation as a food writer, food broadcaster, and
yes.
So I suppose the way I'm coming at this question is I've just left a fascinating talk about wood at this week-long show, and I went to another very, very interesting talk about yeast, and so that's a sort of those are the sort of talks I've been going to. So I was going to say, what can the whiskey industry or whiskey writers learn from, say, the food writers in this sort of context?
I think one of the things that can happen is that a lot of sort of whiskey writers and people interested in whiskey very quickly get to the Harold McGee end. So Harold McGee is a food scientist and his books are amazing, but they are very much of, when you heat water to 100 degrees, this is what happens. And if you add a tomato to it, this is scientifically exactly what happens. And if you do it at 110 degrees, this other thing happens. And I suppose rather than really learning, I think there's an audience for kind of more cultural things. If you look at or historical things, if you look at like Nick's book, I'm sure he'll do really, really well. I think it's a really exciting book to have published, and it's not necessarily all about yeast. It's about history and people, and I think I think I get it's possibly a different cultural thing, because my knowledge was really about Spanish food, and I learned when I lived in Spain in my 20s, and it was gastronomy, so it was food and drink. Nobody that knew about food wouldn't know about wine. They might know more about wine than food, or they might know more about food than wine, but they weren't compartmentalised the way that they are in the English-speaking world. And the thing I found really interesting about even looking at whiskey in Scotland was how much whiskey was what Spanish people would have instead of food and wine. So if anybody's seen the Amber Light film, they've got the writer Ian Rankin does a beautiful piece in that film, and it's very much about his love of whiskey. And part of it is that he's a Scottish writer, he's a cultured person. There is an assumption that he knows about whiskey, that he would like whiskey. There isn't an assumption that he would know about food, in a way that in Spain the assumption would be that you would know about food and wine. And I think there's a thing about whiskey in Scotland that it's very much about hospitality and coming together. And it was one of the things I noticed, I think I put in my book about islands like Uist and Lewis, was if you've ever read Whisky Galore by Compton Mackenzie, the thing that he had that I thought was really interesting was he really understood he really wrote really well about the islanders, and their issue was not about not having whiskey and not being able to drink whiskey. It was that they couldn't offer it to someone else. That if you came round to their house, they could only then offer you some ale or some ginger beer or some tea, and that wasn't hospitality. Whiskey was hospitality. So I suppose what I could say, if there is one thing I suppose whiskey writers could learn from food writers, although I do think Dave Broom does this really well, is kind of bringing people in this pleasure of whiskey. And it's one of the things that I say in the book. Whiskey is middle-aged clubbing. It's really fun. I mean, you see, I joined the Glasgow Whisky Club for about a year, and they're having the time of their lives. They're drinking, they're having 6 whiskies, and it's not that they're drinking too much, it's that they're getting really into it and they're having really good fun in a way that I see the Spanish do that with food. And I genuinely think in Scotland we do it with whiskey. And there could maybe, if there's anything I think whiskey people would have to do to sort of reach out more to the general population, is sell people the experience rather than selling people the process.
And I think it's funny because, in fact, I think a lot of the discussion has been how everyone's moving away from that because it became so tartany, and I think they need to find another route, I suppose. I know how do you think that? I suppose you've answered it in part already, but how do you think the culture of whiskey, is it as important? Is it more important? Is it as...
I think the thing is the culture of whiskey is really different all over the world. And again, I mean, the thing I noticed that I wrote about in my book was the difference between the culture of whiskey geeks and the culture of Scottish people who aren't whiskey geeks, who drink whiskey and like whiskey. They're quite different. To me, what I found really interesting is that if you really, really like whiskey and whiskey is your passion, you have a very strange map of Scotland. Because in your head, the places that are not important to Scottish people in Scotland are really important to you. Nobody goes to Campbelltown. Campbelltown for whiskey people is Mecca, not just the distillery, but Cadenhead's the shop. It is like Mecca. And nobody in Scotland really talks about Campbelltown. And then the same with Islay. I think it was, there's people who were telling me about press trips that they've done to Islay, and they've had me, sort of Americans standing outside Port Ellen distillery drinking some Port Ellen whiskey, and a rainbow comes out and it's sunny and they're crying with the emotion and they can't believe that they're on Islay, when everybody and people in Scotland, that Islay's just one of those islands that are a pain to get to. You know, you have to drive all the way to Kennaicraig, or you have to get the ferry every 2 or 3 days from Moban. And most people are like, why are you really so excited about Islay? And there is such a mismatch, which I find really interesting. And I'll go in for people who really know their whiskey, the kind of people that, you know, that would go with Jason Standing to Drambury. Their Glasgow was 3 pubs. It was the Pot Still, the Bon Accord, and one other one. That is their Glasgow. That, apart from Glasgow, does not exist for them. Apart from those, like it was the Ben Nevis, the Bon Accord, and the Pot Still. That's Glasgow done for them. And I find that really interesting. How there was it was like seeing 2 completely different worlds, which I found really interesting.
There's an interesting thread here that I need to. I do have other questions.
I'll have a look.
Yep. I need to. It's a hot topic here. What whiskey do you recommend to have on porridge?
Oh,
cream, of course.
I think now I really like an Islay whiskey on porridge, but I don't think you should have it with cream. I just think you should have it with water and salt. I don't think you should. I think the way to do porridge properly is have porridge, have cold cream on another plate, and take half a spoon of hot porridge, half a spoon of cream. And what I would do is I would pour a measure of Islay whiskey onto the porridge. But again, if Islay whiskey is not your favourite, I would then put in something Speyside. But I wouldn't put in a sherry cask finish unless it had quite a lot of peat in it. I just think it just disappears.
Well, the sherry would disappear in
the sherry cask finish has something like Macallan. I wouldn't put Macallan, but in a porridge like that, I would. But that's me. I think in the morning, if you're going to go for it, you want to go for it properly and start off with quite a lot of smoke.
Yeah, it's a good tip. Yeah, I hope you got that, James. Yeah, no, and CJ's there. I think there's a couple of people who've already planned their tomorrow's breakfast. So I wanted to also ask you about. I know we've talked about the importance of culture to whiskey, and so the 4 writers that I've invited to do book readings this week have all written very different books, but they all talk about the culture, but also the history. And how do you think that when you visited a grave, do you think that added to that, knowing the history of that whiskey, did that add to your experience?
I think there's a thing that I think it just really depends on what whiskey means to you. I mean, it added to my experience because I really wanted to see how important whiskey was to Scotland, and I realised that actually how it really brought home to me how much blended whiskey was another product of sort of the industrial revolution of Scotland at its height, and how much also it was to do with empire as well, and how much having access to the empire meant this industry could stay as strong as it did. So, I mean, I think I wouldn't like to tell someone else how to enjoy their whiskey. You know, if you really like your whiskey and what you really, really like knowing is exactly how old it is, and you like knowing all about yeast, then I think if that is the thing that makes you happy, then I think you should ignore my book and ignore what I say and go and learn more about yeast and learn more about wood and learn exactly how much aging is. I think you have to do what you enjoy, but I think there's room for people like me to say, actually, this is also about history and about culture and about who we are, and in a way that I think there's plenty of room for both. You know, nobody that, if you look at in food, you've got Harold McGee on the geeky level, and you've maybe got on the other side, you've got Claudia Roden, who's completely about food and culture and how people are. And there's plenty of room for both. They're both incredibly valuable. I don't think you should have to choose. And I think, and I do think they are both really important. I just was more interested in the cultural aspect of it because that's me. It's the thing that I found more interesting about how this happened, how this industry happened, and what it meant to Scotland. And I think it's interesting, you know, if you're Scottish and you go abroad. I was reading, there's quite a few people Scottish people who've ended up in the whisky industry because they've had expat jobs and they've basically spent years doing impromptu whisky tastings. Because it's like, hello, you're from Scotland, what whisky do I drink? And then they've had to learn. You know, I went to Spain, I was 19, and that was the same thing. Everybody first question was, oh, you're from Scotland, what whiskey should I drink? Was the general conversation. And so I suppose what you've got there is just seeing, well, what does it mean to somebody else? Like, if you go to Brazil, what does whiskey mean in Brazil? What does it mean in India? I think they mean quite different things. I don't know exactly what they mean, 'cause I've not been to either place, but they do. But I think they are quite different experiences than for Scottish people in Scotland.
The book, the theme of books and whiskey sort of began. I don't know if you know, but at Whisky.Auction, we auction whiskies, obviously, and spirits. We also auction memorabilia and books. And I did an interview with Nick Morgan a while back, and he recommended some books, saying, okay, what history books do you recommend? Whiskey books. And a handful of books that he recommended were specifically about the history and culture of Scotland, which is actually, I don't think you understand Scotch whiskey without understanding a bit of the background of the industry there. So that was a starting point, and that's where we sort of ended up here. But I have a question for you, which I'm going to slightly spring on you. But what whiskey books do you found influenced your either writing or your understanding of whiskey?
I'd say for research, my understanding of whiskey, it was, you can't go wrong with really anything that Charlie or Dave have written. Charlie McLean and Dave Broom, between Charlie and Dave and Nick Morgan are kind of like the three wise men of Scotch whiskey. They really are. Like, they know everything. So either I talked to Nick or I read Dave's book, or I read one of Charlie's many books. And I think you can't go wrong with any of the three of them. In more historical terms, there seems to be a tendency in about the 60s for a lot of academic men who kind of thought they were what the Spanish would say kind of señores. They kind of thought they were kind of somebody. They would write these whiskey books, and most of them were incredibly dull. But there was this one by David Dashis, which was brilliant. But the thing about David Dashis is he was a cultural historian, so he could write properly. And he knew how to write academically, but he also wrote a lot of biographies. I think he wrote a biography of Robert Louis Stevenson. He wrote one of Robert Burns. He wrote a really good book, actually, called Between the Worlds, which was him growing up in the 30s in Edinburgh, and his father was a rabbi. And his father kind of became kind of unofficially the chief rabbi of Scotland. And he writes brilliantly about that Jewish community and how so many of them were kind of peddlers who arrived from Eastern Europe, and how they ended up speaking it was like the shortest lived language in the world was like Yiddish Scots, because they would speak a mixture of Scots and Yiddish to each other and to other people. And quite a lot of them would drink whiskey, and they'd all call it burnt wine. So his book, apart from the three wise men who are around now, I would recommend David Dash's book. And there was another one that I read that I really liked, and I can't remember the title of it. It might be Distilled, or it might just be Whiskey by Heather Green. And that was it's sort of an introduction to whiskey, which I thought was a really good book worth reading. So those would be the ones that I would recommend. I read a lot of those three books. I read about David. I kind of read also about sort of history of Scotland as well, and also kind of about the history of distilleries. But it would be Dave, Charlie and Nick, and then David Dash's and Heather Green.
Excellent. It's funny, the same names crop up quite a few times in these discussions in this group. I have another question, bringing whiskey and food questions together. James asks, do you think whiskies can pair well with cold cut meats and cheeses, for instance, in the same way that sherry does? So
yes, I think sherry does. And the one thing I don't understand is why in Britain we have port with Stilton, because whiskey with Stilton, especially peated whiskey, is a million times better than port and whiskey. I don't understand it. Essentially, we developed the port industry when we fell out with the French over and during the Napoleonic Wars, and we kind of expanded the port industry. I don't understand why we don't drink whiskey with cheese. I do not understand it. It is so much better. If you're looking, there is a brilliant cheese for every whiskey. Like, if you're looking at I can't remember the name of the distillery. It's really near me. It's the one in. It never ever uses peat. It's a lowland. Well, it's the one that's on the lowlands and the highlands. I now can't remember its name. Glengoyne. It's like 7 miles up the road, so I should know the name. Glengoyne, I think, is amazing with like a kind of softer cheddar or a good Gruyere. And then you want your Lagavulins, or you want a Lafroig if you get that really, really strong blue cheese that you get from the north of Spain, which is like a goat's blue cheese, and it can almost take the roof of your mouth off. When you have incredibly strong blue cheese, you want Lafroig.
I once did back in my Milrose of Soho days. We were invited. They are invited by the British Cheese Foundation, I can't remember, to do a cheese and whiskey tasting, which we gladly agreed to do, and of course realized that we didn't know anything about matching whiskey and cheese. So we invited a group of 30 cheese and 15 cheese experts and 15 whiskey experts to decide which ones matched well. And after an evening of a lot of whiskey and a lot of cheese, we just ended up in a sort of cheesy whiskey brawl. Nothing was resolved. I just remember the chaos, and people. It got a bit shouty. But what I do remember was that Irish Collini seemed to go with every whiskey, and Lagavulin seemed to go with every cheese. So that's
your baseline. Again, I think there's a thing with this where I think you have to work out what works is what worked for you. And I think if you're looking at sommeliers, and if you're a professional sommelier, then and it's your job to know what whiskey goes with which cheese, then you have to know what goes and why. If you're in your house and you're a whiskey enthusiast, even if it's your job to drink whiskey but it's not your job to eat, you know, if you know what I mean. I think what goes well is the one that you like the best. I mean, I think, and I said this in my book, that one of the things to do is when we can get back to seeing people again, is get everybody round, like get a kitty and get some really good cheese and get some really good whiskey and work out what you like yourself. You might, as you say, might end up in a brawl, or you might get 5 different answers.
I was about to say, it's best not to do it with 30 cheese and whiskey
Maybe
experts.
not. No, don't get too many of them because they'll all have a fight. But it is. I think I don't understand why that has not become a thing that's really normal in this country. I genuinely don't understand that, because it's an amazing match. The other thing that whiskey goes really well with, like James was saying about sherry, is it goes incredibly well with Iberico ham. We had it once with Aberlour Abuna and really good Iberico ham. And because Aberlour Abuna's got that really sherry taste, you get the sherry, but you also get the whiskey, and it was the most amazing match. But again, it's also a quality thing. If you've got good quality whiskey, there's no point in getting like the $1.99 melting cheddar from the supermarket. Get good cheese, get good ham, and have good whiskey.
Okay, so after you've done your tour of Scotland, what's next?
Well, I suppose that's me done the book, and that was 3 years ago. And I'm kind of at the moment, well, I'm not writing a novel. I'm supposed to be writing a novel, but I'm mostly looking at things going, oh God, this is a lot of work, about sort of the restaurant industry in London, and kind of before Brexit. That makes it sound really dull, but it's actually just a kind of comedy crime novel. It's not.
But so it didn't sound like a page turner to me, but carry on.
No. I've explained it really, really badly, but it's basically a Glasgow gangster that opens up a restaurant in London.
Okay.
And I'm also doing a podcast, which is kind of, to me, it's called Double Scotch, and it's kind of the continuation of Chasing the Dram. Because Scotch, whiskey in general, has got a lot of really good podcasts. There's things like, especially kind of the daddy of them all, Whisky Cast, and I think they're really, really great on learning about whiskey. But again, what I wanted to do was a podcast that was more the experience of drinking whiskey. So mine is an interview, and it's drinking 3 whiskies in an interview, and it's never really somebody in the whiskey industry. We maybe do one a series in the whiskey industry. So it's not really the whiskey industry. In the drinks industry, we do one a series. So we've got, this series is Pete Brown, who is a beer writer. And if you're really into your whiskey and beer, they're really different things. If you're not in the drinks industry, a drinks writer is a drinks writer. whether they're a wine writer or a beer writer or a whiskey writer, for you it's all the same. So we've had Katie Tunstall and Ian Rankin. We've got Andy Oliver next week. We've got Pete Brown the week after. We've had Max Brooks, who's like Mel Brooks and Bancroft's son. He wrote World War Z, and he basically told me all about zombies while drinking whiskey. So it's very much a podcast about conversation with some whiskey in it, and it's interesting to see how people like different flavours. So we sit with 3 whiskies, and sometimes there's a whiskey I'm thinking, oh God, this isn't very nice, and it turns out to be the whiskey that the person absolutely loves. And sometimes I think, God, thank God I'm not sitting here with whiskey geeks, because like I've not given you a brilliant whiskey and you'll know. And they don't, because they think completely differently to me about what they like, which again is really interesting, I think.
There's James has mentioned a spurtle. I think we're back on the
on the porridge.
That's a made up. It's like a runcible spoon or something, isn't it? I think
no, it actually exists. It's like a long wooden thing that you stir porridge with.
Excellent.
I mean, if you're looking for more whiskey things, I mean, whiskey and food. I mean, that was again one of the reasons that I did the book, was I didn't understand this disconnect. Like, there's whiskey and there's food and there's no join, and I found that really strange. I mean, Scotland doesn't have one recipe with whiskey in it. And even I have a friend from Normandy who's a chef, and she's always saying, oh, you can put a flutter of Calvados in this and you can put a flutter of Calvados in that. And one day I was asked her, why are you so obsessed with Calvados? And she's like, well, my mother's from Normandy, so that's what we've always done. And you'd never see anything in Scotland about putting whiskey in food. I mean, to be honest, if you see anything, the only thing, I mean, you see it when I think the Italians started doing some pasta with vodka in the 70s or something, and then did it with some whiskey. And Seville has this dish in their tapas bars, which is solomillo al whisky, which is kind of just a fried fillet with whiskey. And sometimes you'll see, even in other parts of Spain, they'll flambe prawns with whiskey, but we don't have a tradition of doing that. I know that we now have maybe 1 or 2 chefs that do it, but it's done in a restaurant kind of as a gimmick or something that's part of a menu. It's not done in people's houses. It's not what people do. And to be honest, that was one of the, I think after 3 years, I can say that was one of the failings of that book, and that I really wanted to try and push that dial slightly and go, we should be doing this. And I think what I have seen is there's definitely been more talk of whiskey and cheese. I don't think in any way I was responsible for that, but I don't think there's not been that dial pushing a bit of, we should be, why, we shouldn't be putting rum in cakes, we should be putting whiskey in cakes, why we should be using whiskey for different things that we don't. And
is it seen as a little bit of a waste in Scotland? It's like, oh, don't waste it on food. Is that what
I think so. I think it must be to do with taxes, because I asked Charlie McLean, and Charlie said that he thinks that nobody's thought about it. But I also think, which with Scottish people and our traditions on food wouldn't surprise me. But I do think there's also a thing where I think it's just that because it was so heavily taxed so quickly, it became quite an expensive thing to buy. I mean, even if you look at the end of Whiskey Galore, the film, which if you've not watched the film, you have to watch that film. You have to find it from somewhere and watch it. It's very funny. It's like an Ealing comedy, and they've got the kind of faux posh Gaelic accents, and they're hilarious. But it's a really funny film. And at the very end of it, they talk about how they're all really sad because they can't afford whiskey. They can get whiskey now, but nobody can afford it. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, it was 2 weeks' wages to have a full bottle of whiskey for a sort of working a factory guy's wages. That's a lot of money. And I think there was that in a way that in Spain or in France, brandy or Calvados was kind of still quite small cottage industries in some places, and it was never that expensive. So you would just put it in things to give it extra flavour. And, we wouldn't, because it was too expensive. And it's not now. And you kind of think, if you're ever going to look, if you ever see a recipe for putting brandy in something, put in whiskey. I mean, again, if you're incredibly rich, maybe put in a really good bottle. If you're not incredibly rich, have a look at how much it cost you. I mean, I do think, to me, that always the kind of rule of thumb is if you are crying when you put the whiskey in the food because you think that's a waste of whiskey, don't use that whiskey. Use another one.
I do remember I've only cooked with whiskey once, and I used it in a salmon dish, and it was a disaster. All the maltiness came through, and so I've cooked with, you know, the whiskey maltiness just overwhelmed the fish. So I gave up basically.
You put in too much. That's the problem. Is you put in the amount of whiskey you would have put in of wine. You need to put in very, very little whiskey. You need to look at, like, for every glass, sort of half a glass of wine. If you're going to put half a glass of wine, you really just need to put in like 2 soup spoonfuls of whiskey, and you need to put it in earlier because you need to let the alcohol burn off. Otherwise, you just get the alcohol taste.
Thanks for the tip. That
you really know, genuinely, it's a thing, because I think people then start going, oh, I'll just pour it in. Don't do that. I mean, you're not trying to make a cold cocktail or a hot cocktail. Sorry, you're not trying to make a hot cocktail. You're trying to make food. And it's like when you see, you know, if you watch Italian and Spanish and French chefs on YouTube, which you can find loads, when they're flambeing something, you look at them and they put brandy, and they do that much brandy and that's it, done. They really don't put in very much. And if you've got something like a white fish, you really would want a teaspoon. You really would want like a soup spoonful and then not more for like per
this
fish.
is good to know. Apparently Jamie Oliver did a good mushroom stroganoff recipe with whiskey. Well worth a go. So I think
I did not know that.
I think it seems to, obviously with the porridge it makes sense because the grain, the oats, but
I just think you also have to be careful with competing flavours. I mean, the only thing that I couldn't find, so I mean, there's about maybe 20 recipes in the book, I think. And again, I was trying to do things that you could do at home quite easily, because there's a lot of really good, very chefy recipes, and I was trying to do ballpark whiskey rather than say, because some of the things that I'd found when there are recipes for whiskey, they're very much, you must use this one, and they don't explain what kind of flavour you're looking for. So unless you have like Glenlivet 12 in your house, then you don't know, as a kind of normal person, exactly what you're looking for in that flavour. So I'm kind of very much, don't use this or use that, and what goes and what doesn't. But also, I mean, something like Gravidlax is really good with peated whiskey. But see, if you don't like Islay whiskey and you really hate peat, then it's not the whiskey for you to put in Gravidlax. So again, I think, you have to be very well aware of what you like, and again, and if you take, it's that Anglo thing of being right, which I find bizarre around food. It's that, should I put this whiskey with this salmon? And I'm like, well, do you like this whiskey? Well, no. Well, why are you thinking that you should put that whiskey with the salmon? That's a ridiculous thing to do. You need to almost take away all these ideas of what's right and think what might work and what do you like. So if you're smelling this whiskey and thinking, yeah, and then think about what salmon tastes like, and then think, will that whiskey go with that salmon? And if you're thinking, no, actually, it's going to be a really bad combination, then don't do it. The only thing I think with cream is the best recipe, if you want to start doing anything with whiskey, and it's not even cooking, the best recipe is the Caledonia cream. That is, it's basically one of those really easy desserts for adults. You whip a load of cream up, you add in a load of orange marmalade, then you add in some lemon juice, and then you put in any whiskey you like, because nobody can agree on the best whiskey for that one, because they're all good. So just put in everything.
We've got a comment here from CJ.
You've just frozen, Isabel. I can't hear you or see you. I can see you.
Okay, I'm going to just read CJ's comment out one more time. Have I frozen still? So CJ was saying, I think that's a good approach. Generally, if we go out to dinner, we'll all like something different, and the same applies to whiskey. Therefore, the same applies to whiskey pairings.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that was one of the things I realised that I had done with this book, and I had only realised it was about 6 months after it had been published, and I went to Spain and I was doing a radio programme talking about the book, and I explained what I was trying to do, and the Spanish audience went, "Oh yeah, of course," and I realised that what I had done was actually write an old-fashioned kind of Spanish gastronomy book, but about whiskey. And there was when I started to be able to read Spanish, there was a food writer, and I think he was dead by the time, I think he died in like 1989, called Nestor Lohan. And Nestor Lohan was one of those people that he wrote these books. His recipes were absolutely atrocious. Like, there was no point in even trying his recipes. Nobody could work out where the hell he got them from because they never worked. But what he did was he knew about a region's food, but he'd go somewhere like he would go anywhere in Spain, any region of Spain, and stand there and go, what is the best thing I can do here? What is the best time that I can have? Right, what's the best dish that I can have, and how can I really enjoy this? And he would make you just want to go there with him, because it wasn't even bragging. I don't know how, there was a way of writing that was inclusive of, you could join in with me doing this. And he once talked about being in a restaurant in Peníscola, which is in Valencia, and it's on the coast. And he was talking about how you would go to this restaurant and you'd sit by the sea and you'd finished eating your lunch, and you'd be having a coffee and a brandy, and you'd be looking out into the sea, and all you would want is your life to last as long as possible so that you could come back and do this again and again. And that, to me, was what I wanted to write in the book. And I do think, to an extent, that worked. I think that worked much better than trying to get people to do food and whiskey. I was trying to say to people, this is great, you should join this. This is easy, this is really fun. Stop thinking about whether you're doing it wrong. Stop thinking about what's the right whiskey to like. Stop thinking about what's the wrong whiskey to like. Stop thinking about whether you understand whiskey or not. This is great fun. You should do this. You're too old, if you're reading this, you're an adult, you're too old to go out clubbing anymore. Or when you go out clubbing, you stand there and go, why am I here? Get into whiskey. It's what you used to get on a Saturday night, you can get from whiskey.
That's brilliant, Rachel. I think that's, I think if we carry on from there, that's just such a wonderful place to end, to be honest. I think it's just one. I have all sorts of other questions about food and whiskey, but I'm preventing myself from asking. I think that's just such a lovely. We'll carry on this chat later. But I think that's a lovely place to end. Rachel, just thank you so much. Anyone who came in late or missed any of that. So Rachel McCormack's been reading from Chasing the Dram, and then we had a Q&A. We will attempt to put this recording on our stand tomorrow, along with all our other recordings. And in the meantime, I think we're back here at 3 o'clock tomorrow with a chat about what are we talking about, James, tomorrow? How to date a bottle, which is a chat up line. I don't know. So James, thanks, Rachel. A very refreshing approach. There's a time and a place to be geeky about whiskey, and for it to be just for enjoyment. Brilliant session. Really enjoyed that. There was also, I think earlier on, Vanya said that was brilliant. Rachel, thank you. I've just ordered the book.
Oh, good. I hope you enjoy it.
Anyway, thank you so much for your time. And
thank you for having me.
We'll catch up again soon. Bye.
Fantastic. Bye.